Now barely 3 weeks out from the inauguration of Donald Trump for his second term, we find out that the situation between Russia and Ukraine and the possibilities of ending that war hit a big road bump. Everybody's been talking a lot in the United States, especially since Donald Trump announced that his special envoy to Russia and Ukraine was retired General Keith Kellogg, and this so-called Kellogg plan that he wrote earlier this year in an American publication. And now all of a sudden we hear from Russia, just actually this morning, we've been hearing some things, but this morning, Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister for Russia, just says, yeah, that's not a go for us. We're not going to play with that. That's not something we're even interested in. And he's ready to start moving on. And so to try and unpack what that's going to mean and maybe why Russia's feeling this way, we have one of our absolute favorite guests today, Alexander Mercouris of the Duran. Gosh, just a great analyst and a delight to be around. Welcome back to the show.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here, Daniel, and thank you for your very kind words, your very generous words always.
Listen, let's just jump right into that. What do you make first of all, actually, let me back up a little bit. What do you make of what we've heard anyway is the Kellogg plan? And do you think that it's something that would be appealing to the Russians?
No, not in its current form. And I think they made that absolutely clear. And I think anybody who thought that it would clearly hasn't been listening to what they've been saying, because Kellogg is leaving open the possibility, or at least the article, the original article that was written in April and comments he's made since still seem to leave open the possibility that there would be eventual entry by Ukraine into NATO. And the Russians have repeatedly said that is absolutely out of the question. And again, in that original article, the idea of sending peacekeepers from Europe was floated. And the Russians have consistently opposed any suggestion of European peacekeepers or indeed peacekeepers going into Ukraine at any point. In fact, they were saying that this was unacceptable way back before the special military operation started, when it was first floated, as I remember. So anybody who's been listening to what the Russians have been saying would have known that the plan, if that is the plan, was not going to be acceptable to the Russians. And over the last couple of days, a whole succession of Russian officials, Putin himself, by the way, Lavrov very extensively in the long interview he gave yesterday, which you're leading with, the Speaker of the upper house of the Russian parliament, a person called Matviyenko. They have all been going out of their way to say this, as it stands, cannot work. We've set out our position. NATO membership for Ukraine now or in the future or at any time is for us a red line. We're not going to stop the war unless that is acknowledged. Secondly, European peacekeepers, absolutely out of the question. There has to be a peace deal. There can be a peace deal. There can be negotiations. But we set out what our position was back in June when Putin spoke to the Foreign Ministry Board. And people really need to start listening to us. Now, the Russians have been complaining for a very long time that on everything related to Ukraine, people don't listen carefully to what they say. And they're going out of their way to repeat themselves again. And they're saying that we're not into the business of looking for a freeze. We're not into the business of looking for a ceasefire. We want a permanent, sustainable peace. And basically, they are saying there's not going to be a ceasefire unless that's agreed.
And Gary, if you could put that headline with the call out up there, just for some of our viewers who may not have seen some of Lavrov's comments today. He said that the proposal, as outlined in leaks, the Trump's December 12th time interview, that freezing hostilities along the current line of contact, transferring the responsibility of confronting Russia to Europe. We are certainly not satisfied with the proposals. Sounding on behalf of the representatives of the president-elect's team, Lavrov said, specifically rejecting the idea of introducing European peacekeepers into Ukraine, as your to your point there, and that actually was noticed. I guess to your point here also, that you said that a whole host of folks, Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, also added his 2 cents in there today, where he said that Lavrov recalled that when he was talking about this, he said the first of all, also to what you said, look, there are no prerequisites to talking. We don't have to say you have to agree to this or we won't talk, which is kind of unfortunately how the West operates a lot. They're saying we'll talk right now with no prereqs. However, you have to understand that in June, the head of the state came up with the initiatives for a peace settlement of the conflict in Europe. And in fact, let me just play that, because here's Putin himself reiterating very emphatically what he said on June 14th.
The essence of our proposal is not some kind of temporary truce or suspension of fire, as, for example, the West wants. This is not about freezing the conflict, but about its final completion. And I will say again, as soon as Kiev agrees to a similar course of events proposed today, agrees to the complete withdrawal of its troops from the DPR and LPR in the Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, and really begins this process, we are ready to begin negotiations without delaying them. I repeat, this is our principled position. Neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine, its demilitarization and denazification.
Now, he has been very consistent in saying that all the time. Lavrov said it, I think, in his interview with Tucker Carlson recently, and I guess I didn't see all of his interview today, but apparently it's been reiterated here. But what do you make of that? Because you see, it's almost like these two entities, the Russian side and the Western/US side, are like looking through, I don't know if different lenses is even the right term, but like looking at different wars, because we're talking about what we would like to happen, and the Russians are talking about what they think is going to happen, and they have the control over it. How do you reconcile talking about NATO, talking about European peacekeepers, and really anything, and an immediate ceasefire? How do you see those things playing with what the Russians are saying?
I think you hit the nail on the head, because as far as the Russians are concerned, the reason the war began at all was because they strongly objected to any possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, and they were fiercely opposed to any Western military presence on Ukrainian territory. Those were two things that they were already saying before the war. It's a complete red line, because we think that is going to happen. We are obliged to begin the special military operation, because we see those things as existentially dangerous to ourselves. And now what some people are doing, and I don't think this is Donald Trump, by the way, I don't think he said very much, but what other people, some of them perhaps claiming that they're talking on his behalf, are saying is, we want to do these very things. Arrange for Ukraine one day to join NATO, have Western troops on Ukrainian territory, but this is going to be part of a compromise, what they call a compromise peace deal. Now, the Russians are saying, you cannot be serious. This isn't a compromise as far as we're concerned. This is bringing us exactly to the same point which we were in when we were forced to start the war in the first place. So, of course, we are going to reject it. Now, I think this is something that people in Washington do need to understand, because if the Russians were rejecting ideas like this back in 2021, and by the way, in 2017, when there were negotiations, and in 2015, and in 2014, and in 2008, they are not going to accept it now, when they are on the brink of winning the war. It's simply illogical to think that. So when you say that this is what people wish, you're quite right. But negotiations can't be based on wishes. They have to be based on realities. Insisting on these very things was what got us into the war in the first place. And the Russians are not going to agree to it when they're about to win the war.
And look, let me just graphically show people here. I've shown this to a couple of our guests here, but in case any of our new folks haven't seen this yet, this is obviously this is the front line of contact right now in the Eastern Front primarily. This is where Russians have been moving up in the Pokrovsk area, the Kupiansk area, down even some new stuff down here in the Kherson, etc. But this gray area that people can see on the screen right here, these are the parts of those 4 oblasts that Putin specified in his June 2024 speech there that we just showed you, that are the Kherson, Zaporizhia, Luhansk, and then a little bit up here in the Donetsk area, etc., that Ukraine still possesses. So what Russia is signaling here, and this is really important for the West to understand, and I think it's crucial for Trump to understand too, if he's not, that when Putin is saying, look, I'll talk to you today with no prereqs, but this is the final line here that we're going to have. We're not going to have a ceasefire, meaning that all these combat operations that are going on right now are going to continue going on until they either negotiate these new lines, which would mean all of these Ukraine units you see on the map here would have to withdraw and move back onto their side of the line, or Russia will just continue with the operations until they seize it by force. I think that is a crucial thing that I don't think enough people in the West understand yet.
I completely agree, and I think this is the thing that people have to understand if the negotiations are going to get anywhere. Now, I do want to make one positive point, which is that at least the new people who are coming to office in January are talking about negotiations. They do seem to have a genuine desire to start a dialogue. Kellogg presumably will be going to Moscow at some point. He's going to be meeting all of these people. He'll probably meet Putin himself. He'll certainly meet Lavrov. He'll be meeting whoever is the point man the Russians will select to speak with him and to negotiate things with him in the first, one-to-one from this point going forward. So at least we are going to have a dialogue. And it's not unusual in conflicts for people sometimes to take unrealistic lines before negotiations begin and then to start to adjust them as they speak to the other side and perhaps start listening to what the other side is saying. But when it comes to the Russians, don't expect too much flexibility. The point is that the Russians, from their point of view, have been negotiating about Ukraine since 2014. That's 10 years. So they're not coming to this new. They're coming to this very, very jaded and very cynical. And of course, they're winning.
And I want to go back real quick to that map that I was showing you about, because there's something also really important here. You said that, with obviously this particular version of the war has been going on since February 2022. We're literally closing in now on the 3-year mark of that. And some people think, well, yeah, and if the war goes on another 3 years, it'll continue on at this, snail's pace, et cetera. But look, I want people to understand here. You made a comment a second ago that when Russia is winning the war and are close to winning, I think that was the phrase you used. And here's why that is. You see all of these black lines and dots and whatever. These are fortifications that Russia has already chewed through. And then here's the ones that are currently in front of them in these areas right here. And one of the key ones down here is the Pokrovsk area we talked about, because it's got a lot of fortifications around it, et cetera. But you see Russia continues to chew through them here. But the big issue is, look beyond these areas. What do you see out here? A lot of green grass. So not a lot of fortifications. Once Russia is able to penetrate and break through these right here, there's not much left. So if this thing grinds on, for example, if the Trump team comes in and isn't willing to make these concessions that the Russian side is asking for, and you just accurately pointed out, they're not in a mood much to be giving much in their objectives, what they want to achieve, because they see that if there's no deal, if there's no negotiations, the Russian side can and is capable of just seizing with military force what they can otherwise take in diplomatic forms. And I guess the thing I want to ask the next here is that how do you see the incoming Trump team, especially with this view, and this can also go on to Keir Starmer, who's also made some odd statements in just the last couple of weeks about winning for Ukraine. Don't know where that came from. But if that's your mentality, and this is the lens you've been looking through, but it doesn't match what I'm showing on the map here, it's going to be hard for Trump to agree to these kind of terms, don't you think?
Well, it is going to be going to be hard, which is why he needs to be realistic from the first day. He's got to understand that a lot about the things that are said about this war are simply wrong. That the Russians are definitely winning. That they're not going. This isn't going to be reversed. There's no set of sanctions that people can impose that are going to change the situation. There's no weapons the United States can supply that are going to change the situation. And no doubt the Russians have suffered a lot of casualties in this war, but that's not going to make them less determined. It's going to make them more determined to see this thing through. Because
now, I wonder if you could go down that path a little bit more, because that it almost seems counterintuitive to at least some of our American audience, that you're like, wait, you've suffered all these casualties. Media Zona actually says the number of dead Russians is 85,000, which is an enormous number. By the way, that's almost as many as the U.S. lost in World War I in total. And so it would seem like, well, they're probably tired of losing that. But you say that could actually make them want to be even more forceful. Why do you say that?
Well, first of all, there's two things to say. Firstly, for Russia, and we are talking about Russia, 85,000 is not a crippling loss. This is a country which has had much experience of war. It suffered huge losses in the past. This is a bearable level of loss, but it is nonetheless sufficiently high to make the Russian people feel committed, that their country is committed to a conflict. And they will be wanting to see that the sacrifice of those lives, of those soldiers, has achieved that which they were promised it would achieve, which is security for Russia. That's why those soldiers have fought. That's why they've died. Russian society will not want to accept anything less. And that is something that Putin and the people in the Kremlin not only have to take into account, but if you listen to Putin and the way he speaks, I think he shares that feeling himself.
In what sense that he shares it?
That the sacrifice that these men have made should not be in vain. That's why the Russians are talking about a long-term peace, a permanent, sustained peace, one which secures for Russia long-term protection. Because unless that is what Russia comes back with the war from, then all those people who died, their families, their friends, well, their families and their friends will be saying that they died in vain and that the sacrifice was in vain. So it's not a big enough loss to cripple the Russians, but it's a big enough loss to make the Russians determined to keep fighting until the objective is achieved.
Yeah, and you see on the screen there that the Ukrainian general staff claims that Russia's lost 780,000 troops, which I find just not credible, just based on evidence. So I don't think that, but the number of the actual losses is still quite high. Let's look at a different factor of how this, because this is going to play into the negotiations. The idea that Ukraine can just, as long as we give them more stuff, more ammunition, more weapons, whatever, they'll just keep going until we can get a better deal negotiating. But as some interviews have come out recently among some of the Ukrainian soldiers, it's given a little bit of a glimpse inside the mentality of the Ukraine force that too few in the West recognize. Watch this interview here and look at his state of mind as much as you do his words.
Розбили. Ми відходили, відійшли. І багато з пацанів вже ніхто не хотів напередок вертатися. І так, якось так. А комбат почав збирати ще, там хто лишився, щоб ще раз відправити. Багато не хотіло йти, і то стало так, як підштовхом, що жити хотіли всі тоді. Молоді хлопці, не дуже обстріляні були такі, всі села, всі такі трудяги.
So this is the other half of that equation. You talked about the Russians and the price that they paid. Well, the Ukrainian side is even higher, and the personnel is starting to be a real problem. I mean, this particular guy was talking about why they basically left the fight without authorization because they wanted to live. And we've seen some information in the Western press that says upwards of 100,000 Ukrainians have deserted and just left the fighting. And so the question has to be asked, how much longer can the continuity of the Ukraine armed forces itself remain a viable entity to continue fighting like this?
This is a very difficult question to answer, but briefly, you're absolutely correct. Now, I mean, that figure, was it 787,000 Russian losses? This is an absurd figure, in my opinion. I mean, Russia would not be able to absorb that level of losses and keep advancing in it in the way that it is. The trouble is, I'm afraid that these numbers which are coming out of Ukraine about Russian losses have misinformed many people, and perhaps explain why many people assume that the Russians are looking for a way out of the war, when every indication suggests that they are not. Now, there are no reports of mass desertions on the Russian side like there are on the Ukrainian. And you don't see pictures like this in Russia. Now, you know, Russia has a very extensive social media. If something like this was going on there, I think even with all the controls that happen there, and they do exist, something would be coming through. And that's an important thing to bear in mind. Now, about Ukraine, every day now, almost, I see film like that. I hadn't actually seen that particular one, but you saw how tired and exhausted and demoralized that soldier was. I was reading earlier today a piece in the BBC, and it was absolutely clear reading it. There were Ukrainian soldiers, there were Ukrainian civilians in Dnipro, an important town on the Dnieper River. They are exhausted. They all admit this, that they can't keep on the battle for much longer, that the Russians, there are many more of them, they keep coming. They're better equipped, they're better armed, they're by now a lot better trained, much more experienced. That's the article, in fact. Ukraine is running down. And going back, if you look at the title, Can Ukraine Face Another Year of War? Well, the article actually doesn't answer that question, doesn't explicitly give an answer to it. But when you read it, you come away very much with the sense that the answer is going to be no, that Ukraine is too tired, its army is too badly wounded for it to be able to keep up the battle for very much longer. And Daniel, you were pointing to the maps, you were showing all those fortified lines. Obviously, the Russians are chewing through those, and they're chewing through them faster and faster. And once they get past those fortified lines, as you rightly say, there is large open spaces. But it isn't just fortified lines. If the Ukrainians are going to hold the Russians back, once they've broken through those fortified lines, they need an army capable of fight and maneuver to hold them. And it's increasingly looking as if they don't have it. That's the article.
Yeah, which really, emphasizes the futility of continue on, and that's one of the things I'll just say that just that really aggravates me, if not outright angers me, is that when I hear all these people saying, we just need to keep providing arms and ammunition for Ukraine. And in fact, Gary, if you can toss up that headline there today, that the United States has announced $3.4 billion in additional total aid. A lot of that was military aid, and some of it was humanitarian aid and just operational funds, et cetera. But another $3.4 billion. And then that brings up the total from the U.S. alone to $170 billion in total assistance. And one has to ask the question, I do expressly ask the question, what is this aid intended to produce? So you say you want to help them, quote, have a negotiating position, but no one has said, and you correct me if I'm wrong or if you've heard of it, negotiate what? So we've heard Putin say, here's my negotiating positions, these 4 oblasts, no NATO, and an independent, unaligned, non-nuclear Ukraine. That's what his position is. But when now then Zelensky and his backers in the West say, we want a better negotiating, and all this money and ammunition and weapons, et cetera, or to help them have a just peace is what I've heard. No one has defined what just peace looked like. Have you heard anybody say, this is what we're trying to accomplish?
Well, the closest we've ever come to is Zelensky's proposal, his so-called peace plan, which is that the Russians pull out of Ukraine completely, including Crimea. The Ukrainians reoccupy all that territory, and then there can be negotiations. And he actually said at the negotiations about reparations that Russia's going to pay to Ukraine, and about war crimes trials of Russian officials, including presumably Putin himself. Now, that is the kind of demand that you make when you're winning a war or about to win a war, not when you are losing it. But that is all that Zelensky has officially come up with. That remains his peace plan. So no one else, you're quite right in saying this, the American government, the British government, the French government, the EU Commission, they've never actually clearly defined what they say a victory, or at least a satisfactory and just end of the war would be, because they always say the same thing, that it's not for us to decide that, it's for Ukraine to decide that, which gives Zelensky, in effect, the right to decide US policy, because he can string out the war for as long as he can. He might have personal interests in doing that, but the United States, so long as he remains president of Ukraine, cannot supposedly move. Now, at last and finally, it does seem that with the change of administration, we're seeing the end of that particular nonsense. But precisely because we've hidden behind Ukraine, we've hidden behind Zelensky, that we've never come up with any real proposal of our own about how the war can be ended in a way that the Russians might be interested in, and which might bring the war to an end.
Well, and see, that's kind of to get to my point, because if you don't know what you're seeking, then how do you know if, number one, it's even possible, or number two, when you're putting $175 billion worth of assets, or even just $3.4 billion today, you've got to know what that's going to do to accomplish your outcome. I mean, imagine how absurd it is if a company, we'll just keep it civilian for a moment, says, I'm going to allocate, $1 billion to make my side better. What do you mean? Make what better? I don't worry about it. Just issue the money, buy a bunch of assets and things. And who knows if they coordinate or produce anything of positive value for the company. That would be malfeasance to the highest degree. And the guy would be fired immediately that allocated that if it was a civilian firm. This one is far worse, because militarily, I can tell you how all of the things that were part of those packages that were announced, starting back with the one on Friday, they don't do anything to change anything on the battlefield. It's just more stuff. And it's, what the reason why I have this anger here is because men like we just showed you, the troops on the ground are going to pay with their lives for this futility and absurdity. And I think that gets too little focus in the West.
This is absolutely correct. I mean, what is another $3.5 billion going to do when 171.5 billion dollars didn't deliver victory? I mean, it's absurd. All it's going to do is it's going to result in other broken men like the one we saw in that video. You are absolutely correct about this. And this is the most shocking and terrible thing about the war, the way the war has been run throughout. And your point about, not coming up with proper ideas about how the war should end. Well, if I could just say, Daniel, you were making this point way back in 2022. You were saying, we need a plan. We need an idea of what we're actually doing here, because without one, we're just going to go on and on and on, and things are going to get worse and worse, and they're going to get worse and worse for Ukraine, and people are going to die, and it will all in the end be for nothing. And of course, if we'd had a coherent plan in 2022 and a negotiating strategy then, well, we might be in a very different position from the one in which we are in now. It's because no one in any position of authority in the West has had that kind of realization, has done those things which they should have done, starting from the day the war started, to try to find a way to bring it to an end, because none of them have done that, that we are in the position that we are now, what we're in now.
And it just boggles my mind. It's just, I have a hard time getting my head around that, because it's also self-defeating. Now, the Biden administration, I mean, they're literally just shoveling everything they have out the door as they're leaving. They're cleaning out their offices in the White House, probably because they're about ready to leave. And so, fine, they can clean their hands as they walk out the door. But who is that benefiting? Because if there's no path to fixing all the stuff that you very appropriately called 171.5 billion didn't make any difference, why do you think this 3.5 here at the end is going to? I mean, why do people give money like this and with no idea where it's going? And I guess a good example of that, which I'd like, I don't know if you saw it or not, but it's been at least a month ago, maybe a little longer at that. Boris Johnson was on a podcast in the UK, and he was asked kind of, do you regret any of the decisions that you made while you were the prime minister? And I think indirectly they were talking about that April 2022 deal in Istanbul, which he allegedly sunk. And he seemed to say no at all. In fact, yeah, he would be supportive of what Biden's doing here. Why would Boris Johnson go down that path when it's self-evidently not effective?
Well, this is the greatest failure of statesmanship in the West that we've had since the Second World War. I mean, we've had many bad mistakes, many terrible things done, but this has been the worst. I mean, this has been a huge war in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of men probably have died. I've no doubt, in fact. Cities have been devastated. A country is being destroyed. And the people who have led us into the situation still don't seem to understand the enormity of what they have brought about. A war, by the way, which was completely avoidable. All it needed was one very simple thing: to say to the Russians and to the Ukrainians, sorry, the interests of the West and of preserving peace in Europe mean that Ukraine cannot join NATO. That's it. And we would not have had a war.
Yeah, there would have been room to discuss any other issues there, but it is very clear that Russia would not have taken the huge issue move to invade their country, their neighboring country, if it weren't for that, because they truly viewed it as an existential threat, which they've been saying, as you pointed out, since 2008. I want to hit a couple things here that both Lavrov and Putin have said recently to kind of set the stage for what's about to happen when Trump takes over here. One of the things that was part of the Kellogg plan that apparently Trump is a big supporter of, which he had said a little bit during the campaign, was he wants an immediate ceasefire. He wants to stop the fighting right now so that they can do some negotiations. Here's what Lavrov said about that, I think yesterday.
We cannot be satisfied with empty talk. So far, all we've heard is talk about the need to come up with some kind of truce. And it's not particularly hidden that this truce is needed in order to gain time to continue pumping weapons into Ukraine. A truce is a road to nowhere. We need legal agreements that will fix all the conditions for ensuring the security of the Russian Federation, in a context that will secure the impossibility of violating these agreements in an internationally legal manner.
I said that was yesterday. It was actually 4 days ago. But obviously that's still very current in here. Why do you suppose that the Russians would not be willing to have a ceasefire? Because it almost seems like, well, that makes sense. You stop the war where it's at right now. Your guys stop dying, and then you can negotiate a final end. And if you need to, you can start it back up. But why is Russia so emphatic that no ceasefire at all?
Can I just quickly say, Lavrov has given 2 interviews. He gave one 4 days ago and he gave one yesterday. So that's probably where the confusion is. The Russians are taking this position because of what I said before, that they've been negotiating and trying to find a solution going all the way back to the start of the 2014 fighting. And they have been very embittered by what has repeatedly happened, because there have been many ceasefires. There was one negotiated in September 2014. There was the February 2015 ceasefire, which was part of the Minsk agreement. Those ceasefires were never honored. The whole mechanism of negotiations of the deal that was agreed in February 2015, the Minsk agreement, which was supposed to lead to a whole sequence of events that would result in peace being restored to Ukraine. That was never implemented. And the Ukrainians have come forward and have straightforwardly admitted now that they never had any intention of implementing it. And the Germans and the French, Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, have said that they knew that that was what the Ukrainians were doing all along, and they were perfectly content to let the Ukrainians do it. So after that experience of being fooled, not once, but 2 or 3 times, the Russians are saying they're not going to go there again. They're not going to have another ceasefire, which will just give Ukraine another chance to do what it did after Minsk, spin the whole thing along, rearm, and then start the war all over again.
Wow, that's fascinating. I hadn't thought of it from that perspective, but when you say it like that, that actually makes a lot of sense. That it seems to me, and tell me if I'm understanding what you're suggesting, is that Russia, on that map I showed you a minute ago with the gray areas, we're moving to seize and secure that by whatever means we can. If you don't come to an agreement before I get there, we'll simply take it, and then I'm not going to worry about it. Or we can have a negotiated settlement between then, and then we'll stop the fighting as you roll out of those things. Is that basically what you think the Russian position is?
Exactly. I think that the Russians would go for a ceasefire, just a ceasefire, on only one condition. There's only one situation where they would agree to a ceasefire. That is if Ukraine confirmed that it was going to pull all its troops out of the 4 regions and made a public commitment that it would not agree, that it would give up its bid for NATO membership and would accept neutrality. In that case, there might possibly be a ceasefire. Putin floated that possibility back in June, but I cannot imagine any other situation where they would agree to that.
Well, in fact, speaking of the NATO membership, that's one of the other things that Putin here a couple of days ago actually addressed as well, because part of the other thing about the Kellogg plan is that, hey, we'll just push off talk about NATO for like 10, maybe 20 years or something like that. And in the West, I think the thought was, okay, we'll just push it off. Number one, Trump at the most has 4 years, so he'll be long gone before this comes up. And we'll basically just kind of put it off the table. And everyone has known, and I'll say this too, I'm very confident of this in the West, the vast majority. No one ever thought Ukraine was actually coming in NATO. Why would they want an Article 5 guarantee on that instability that has existed all the time, or put their security in the hands of what somebody in Ukraine wants to do? I think that realistically, they never thought it was coming into. So they may think that now by just shuttling it off, till 10 years, then that'll be fine, because then it's really a non-issue. But when Putin was asked about that, here's what he said.
I don't know what they are saying right now in the new upcoming team of the next American president, but in 2021, President Biden back then proposed exactly that. He said that they would postpone the ascension of Ukraine to NATO for the next 10 years because it was not ready. And I responded, yes, it wasn't ready. But what you will do is you will prepare it and then make it part of NATO. So it's actually not that long of a period. For us, it doesn't matter whether it's 1 year or 10 years. In historical terms, that's not so much. And I don't know if that is the true opinion of the Trump's team. But what's the difference between the proposals that you shared right now and the proposals of Biden's old administration? I don't know how the situation is going to develop going further and what the orders will be given by President Trump to his administration, but we will see.
So again, he's saying, yeah, we're willing to talk, But there's pretty much a non-negotiable issue on the peacekeepers, on NATO involvement, and on the location of where the Russians are going up to. So I guess really my question is, what happens if the Trump side doesn't recognize those three things and thinks that they're going to have a negotiated settlement? Now, we just talked about militarily. They have the capacity, the wherewithal, the resources, the manpower, everything that they need. They can just go and seize them. But then what happens? What happens if they haven't reached some kind of a negotiated settlement to then, and then the war simply still exists at the end of the time when they've taken those territories?
Well, there's the question: what will the Trump people do, and what will the Russians do? Well, I can tell you what they should do. They should keep talking. I mean, even if there is no possible way to reconcile these differences, and the war goes on, and the Russians push forward and push to the Dnieper, and then perhaps push beyond the Dnieper because Zelensky refuses to compromise, and because the United States can't compromise. They should keep talking, because the negotiations, the talks in themselves, something might still come out. The Russians are themselves uncertain about how the war can end. There was a very interesting article by a Russian journalist called Dmitry Trenin, who lived in the United States. He was a former Soviet military man. He was an army officer, but he then converted to academic work and scholarship and journalism. He's worked in the United States for a while, but he's come back to Russia. He wrote a very interesting article, and he said, look, we've got to start thinking also about how the war ends. And there's various scenarios we can think about, but we should never overlook that our ultimate objective is to secure our Western borders, to achieve peace for ourselves, a sustainable long-term peace in Europe. And yes, we can advance all the way to Western Ukraine. We can occupy, we can reach Poland, the borders with Poland, but that won't bring us peace. The best way to bring peace is through some kind of negotiation, some kind of outcome, a deal, which he didn't, in fact, say this, but logically, it can only be achieved if there's some kind of an agreement with the United States. Now, I think that is something that a lot of Russians are saying.
And let's look at the other side of that line here, because one thing that does not give confidence that Trump is going to be able to make those hard decisions, because two reasons. First of all, Trump doesn't like to lose. He doesn't like to be seen as losing. And to agree to those terms right now, when Ukraine still owns a good portion of at least three of those oblasts, that would be seen, and certainly his political opponents would seize on this and say, you just handed this stuff over to Putin as though there were a choice, and he just chose to do it. But the second part is about the Ukrainian side is just a few days ago, Zelensky's not making any kind of comments about that he's looking for a negotiated settlement. He's looking to keep fighting.
Ми обов'язково продовжимо завдавати ударів по російських військових об'єктах дронами і ракетами, і все більше українськими по саме тим військовим базам, по саме тій російській воєнній інфраструктурі, яка використовується в такому терорі проти наших людей. Наш захист абсолютно справедливий.
So here's the problem, or one of many, I guess. If no deal is reached before Russia takes those four oblasts in their entirety, and if Ukraine is still saying we're just going to keep fighting, then Russia is put in an unenviable position from their perspective, that I may not want to drive up to the Polish border. I may not want to go up to Romania or anywhere else. But if you keep fighting, I don't have any choice but to keep going. They're not going to just stop, I wouldn't think. But then that's also complicated, because then the question has to be, will Trump, if in the failure of negotiations and the desire for Zelensky to keep fighting, will he keep supplying the amount of ammunition that you need to keep going down there, assuming that the Ukrainian army doesn't break somehow? You see, this could get real messy real quick.
It could get very, very messy indeed. And I mean, this is we're starting to look towards the end game, and end games can often be extremely difficult. Now, this is where it becomes important, because if I have to be honest about this, I don't think we're going to get any kind of agreement between the US and Russia over Ukraine soon. Trump may want a deal quickly, but it's impossible to see how he can deliver one. You're absolutely correct. If he makes the concessions to the Russians that the Russians are demanding, he'll be criticized. People will say he's capitulated to Putin and he's surrendered Ukraine. And he's not going to want to do that. But that's where keeping talking becomes important. Because, of course, the further west the Russians go, the more important it is, the more easy perhaps, or at least the conditions for a deal might start to emerge, because the Russians don't want to go all the way to the west. I think that's what Trenin is saying. I think that's the general sentiment in Russia. That is what I'm hearing. And we presumably in the West don't want to see them get too close to the West. We shouldn't want the Russian army again on the Polish border or on the Hungarian border or in any of these places. We too should want to come to some kind of an agreement with the Russians, which keeps them a significant distance from reaching that border as well. And then once the four oblasts, the topic of the four oblasts, if you like, has been taken off the table, and when the Russians perhaps are across the Dnieper but have not advanced all the way to the western border, and nobody any longer thinks that NATO is really even a theoretical option, then perhaps, but not before, a deal will be done. It's going to require very, very strong nerves on both sides to make that happen. But it is nonetheless better that it does end that way, because the big danger from this conflict is that we're going to end up with no deal at all. The Russians will push all the way to the western border. They'll try and occupy western Ukraine. We will have a long period of time of great instability and tension in Europe. The United States, which has lots of other interests around the world and which wants to focus on its own problems, is going to be stuck in Europe because it's going to have to deal with that situation also. So better find a way out. Perhaps you can't do it now because the distance is too great, but keep talking and then events might lead you there.
Well, that's very good advice indeed. And if I hope somebody from the Trump team is watching this show today, because that's exactly right. I guess it kind of an ending here. The thing that just really anguishes me is that any rational person, and I mean any rational person in the West, can just look at the resources available to both sides, and that includes allies on both sides, and the manpower issues, industrial capacity, all that stuff. You can see that there is no path to ever win back anything for the Ukraine side. So given that reality, your best case scenario would be to somehow avoid total defeat or be defeated. And if that's the best you can go for, it makes no sense to keep shoveling resources like, money over and over into a flame just to consume it with no return on investment, no positive outcome. Ergo, we should do what you suggest and just find the best way we can to bring this to an end. That's the only thing that's rational at this point.
I completely agree. I mean, I have to say, one of the shock revelations for me this week is that the United States sent 500 ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, according to the New York Times. What did that achieve? I mean, these weapons are supposed to be in short supply. Obviously, it's killed quite a few Russians, done a certain amount of damage. It's infuriated the Russians because missiles were launched into Russian territory, but it hasn't helped Ukraine. So why go on doing this? We are where we are. Opportunities for peace existed before. The entire war was avoidable. If we'd done what you, Daniel, suggested back in 2022 and looked for a way out, then we would be in a better place now. But we are where we are. Keep talking. And as I said, keep strong nerves. It does require strong nerves. And a way out perhaps can be found in the interests of all concerned: Russia, United States, Europe, and of course, the tormented nation of Ukraine.
Right. And I say there's no rational outcome. There is, in some twisted minds, an irrational outcome that they seek. And I think that this is one of the rare moments of honesty sleeping out by accident, I guess, when not too long ago, Lindsey Graham talked about what he thought the real reason we were waging this war.
Ukraine is still standing. This war is about money. People don't talk much about it. But you know, the richest country in all of Europe for rare earth minerals is Ukraine. $2 to $7 trillion worth of minerals that are rare earth minerals, very relevant to the 21st century. Ukraine's ready to do a deal with us, not the Russians. So it's in our interest to make sure that Russia doesn't take over the place. It's the breadbasket of really the developing world. 50% of all the food going to Africa comes out of Ukraine. We can make money and have an economic relationship with Ukraine that'd be very beneficial to us with peace. So Donald Trump's going to do a deal to get our money back, to enrich ourselves with rare earth minerals, a good deal for Ukraine and us, and he's going to bring peace.
You know what's ironic, if not outright perverse, is that all those things he just talked about would have been absolutely on the table if we had made that deal well, before the war, but certainly in Istanbul in 2022, because then that would all be possible. But now the way it is, so much of the Donbass is gone and so much more is going to be gone. So many of these areas that were rich and fertile and, you know, in rare earths and everything else and produce are going to be on the Russian side.
Well, you're absolutely right. That's why one should always prefer peace to war. I mean, obviously, there are some situations where you are obliged. You have to defend yourself, obviously. But these kind of wars are always a mistake. A good deal, a good negotiation the Istanbul deal, as you rightly say, which of course people like Lindsey Graham weren't happy with, would have delivered all these various things that he's talking about. But the thing that always horrifies me about this is that every so often you do see the cynicism slip through beneath the mask. I mean, you hear all this rhetoric about Ukraine, about defending against Russian aggression, about standing up for the rights of small countries, all that kind of thing. And then the mask slips and suddenly you realize, well, you're told, well, actually, there are other reasons. It's all about money in the end. And if I was a Ukrainian, I'd be choking if I heard that.
Yeah, because not only are we now not going to get the money, or at least a good portion of it, Russians will, and the Ukraine nation has been just castrated. I think somebody in the comments said it used a second ago, and that's probably the most accurate word. I mean, they've gutted entire generations of men that can never be brought back. They're thinking about going to a new generation of men, and man, at some point, this madness has to come to an end. Or if, you know, honestly, I'm a little surprised. I'll just say here in closing that some of the Ukraine people haven't risen up on the inside to say, just stop this insanity, because they see with their own eyes how this is unwinnable and the price they're paying.
Oh, that's absolutely correct. And I mean, whatever one says about Ukraine, I mean, the people there have fought with great courage. And I think that has to be acknowledged. I think there are a lot of people in Ukraine who do understand now the realities. Unfortunately, they were promised a lot of things which we were not in a position to deliver. And that was the wrongest thing that we did. We led them along. John Misheimer, Professor Misheimer, has talked about us leading Ukraine up the primrose path to its own destruction. And that's what we've done. I say we, obviously not you and me, but our leaders have a lot to answer for in this.
Yes. Yeah. And I think history is going to be very, very harsh to this whole generation of leaders. But, you know, having harsh words spoken to them at the cost of all these caskets that are buried in the ground is going to be little equality there. But anyway, we're going to continue to track this, and we really, really appreciate you coming on today and sharing these insights, as we always do. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Daniel. My great pleasure.
And wish you a merry, happy New Year.
Absolutely.
See that.
Me too. A very happy New Year to you, to everybody on your channel, and that includes, of course, the people who are watching us now.
All right, and thank you very much. We will be back to you here in about an hour. We're going to have Ted Postal come on to talk about some of the truth about what's going on with missile defenses and lots of claims about different things in the West and in the Ukraine in particular, maybe even some in the Middle East with some of the claims of how interceptors have been working. He's going to come on and tell you about what the reality is. He's got some new research that he's going to show us today. You're not going to want to miss this. Tune back in at 3 p.m. Eastern time on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and we will see you then.